Monopolies.
Okay, I might as well get started. Uh, Welcome, one and all. This and that information on the Autonomous Collective.net. I'm going to talk a little bit about capitalist mode of production and monopolies. It's covering the reading group for the critical theory working group, and I'm going to look at some of their readings, not all of them, and certainly it's going down some interesting but yet problematic tasks. So, in today's little bit, there will be mention of a couple of folks less well known relative to, I think, the primary project of the critical theory working group, which is mainly on Adorno and Horkheimer. But it got me sort of following a different path for a person by the name of Pollock, um, not the abstract expressionist painter. The point being, of course, that the capitalist mode of production, or CMP, is it's important to the to the Frankfurt School in a variety of ways. On the one hand, it's important to make a relation between what we might refer to as cultural studies, which is a sort of broad covering term for the critical theory, and it's not purely cultural in a particular sense. On the other hand, there is a political economy analysis that remains part of the Frankfurt School, which sort of needs to be worked out because a majority of the efforts have been, of course, on the philosophical side. Um, and in fact, the identification of political economy as a kind of failure for um, Frankfurt School critical theory is an interesting question. It's not pursued deeply in a variety of English translated texts, but it seems that the Germans did a much better job, certainly. So it's an excerpt from a 2009 book, which has served as the reading material for the first couple of critical theory working group meetings. And more recent article is from a text called Rethinking Imperialism, a study in capitalist rule of 2009 by John Milios and Dimitris P. Soteropoulos, of 2009. I've included videos by both authors at the end. This is chapter 6 from that book. It's short. I should be able to get through it today. Capitalist mode of production and monopolies, the theoretical problem. As stated in the previous chapters, the idea of a final stage of capitalism, shaped by the formation of monopolistic enterprises that eliminate capitalist competition, was first introduced into Marxist literature by Rudolf Hilferding's Finance Capital of 1909, a book strongly influenced by the ideas put forward by J.A. Hobson in his Imperialism, a Study. And of course, Hobson's 1901 book is important for Lenin. Hilferding has always been regarded as a major Marxist theoretician of his time, who further developed Marxist theory by extending consideration to certain socioeconomic developments of capitalism that had not made their appearance during Marx's lifetime. That is, the formation of monopolies and the evolution of capitalism into a new ultimate stage. In what follows, we propose to argue against the above hypothesis. Our main argument will be that, although it was regarded as the Marxist orthodoxy for nearly 8 decades, the theory of monopoly capitalism, that is, the theoretical system first introduced through Hilferding's Finance Capital, constitutes an interpretation of Marxist theory that is more in the character of a revision than a further development or actualization of Marx's theoretical analysis. 6.2, Marx's value theory and the early Hilferding. As argued in Chapter 5, Marx's economic theory, and more specifically his value theory, does not have as its object of study any specific capitalist country or historical form, that is, a historical stage of capitalism, but that the CMP, capitalist mode of production, that is, the structural elements of the capitalist system as such, irrespective of its specific forms of historical appearance or level of development. According to our understanding of Marxian value theory, Marx's theory of value constitutes not a modification or correction of classical political economy's theory of value, but a new theoretical domain, thus shaping a new theoretical object of analysis. Marx's notion of value does not coincide with Ricardo's concept of value as labor expended. It constitutes a complex notion, a theoretical conjunction which makes possible a deciphering of the capital relation through combining the specifically capitalist features of the labor process with the corresponding forms of appearance of the products of labor. In this way, value becomes an expression of the capital relation and of the capitalist mode of production, independently of any temporal or spatial peculiarities, historical era, geographical region, or country. In Marx's theoretical system, money constitutes the only form of appearance of value. Value is determined, of course, by abstract labor, that is, by capitalistically expended labor, that is, labor process for exchange and for profit. But abstract labor does not constitute an empirical magnitude that can be measured with a stopwatch. It acquires a tangible existence only in the process of exchange, in the price of the commodity. The essential feature of the market economy of capitalism is thus not simply commodity exchange as maintained by mainstream theories, but monetary circulation and money. The Marxian analysis holds that exchange is necessarily mediated by money. In Marx's theory, both value and money are concepts that cannot be defined independently of the notion of capital. In summary, the value of commodities never appears as such, as an immediately perceivable, that is, empirically observable, and thus measurable entity. It finds expression only through the forms of appearance, that is, commodity prices. The forms record the relationship of exchange between each commodity and all other commodities. Hence, value and price are not commensurable quantities. They belong to different levels of abstraction. Value is the concept that deciphers prices, shows what prices are without determining their exact level. Values, as such, cannot be measured quantitatively, and it is even more impossible to refer to the level of any value at all as such, taken in isolation. In Marx's words, value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity. Hilferding, in his early writings, 1904, adopted a different mainstream interpretation of value theory, which we have elsewhere defined as Ricardian Marxism, or the classic version of the value theory. This version incorporates into Marxist theory the viewpoint of the classical school of political economy on value as labor expended. From this perspective, the value of each commodity is determined independently and is commensurable, that is, qualitatively identical with price, i.e., belongs to the category of empirically tangible quantities. Consequently, value can be reduced to production price by means of mathematical calculation via some kind of MELT, M-E-L-T, the monetary expression of labor time. Now, Hilferding defended the main thesis of Ricardian Marxism, namely the commensurability between value and price, as follows. We have commensurability inasmuch as prices and values are both expressions for different quantities of labor. They are qualitatively homogeneous. So this is, this is an important distinction that can be, of course, problematic. He initially praised this Marxian value theory. That is, the law of value is not canceled by the data of the third volume of Capital, but is merely modified in a definite way. Section 6.3, Marx's concept of social capital. Most important for our analysis is the fact that despite different interpretations of Marx's economic analysis, most versions of Marxism until the publication of Finance Capital accepted an identical point of view concerning the relationship between the capitalist economy as a whole and the individual enterprise. This point of view was based on theses explicitly formulated by Marx outlining a fundamentally macroeconomic approach to the capitalist economy. According to it, the immanent causal regularities, that is, laws of the capitalist system, apply at the level of the capitalist economy and society as a whole, from where they are imposed as incentives on the individual constituent elements of this economy. As Marx clearly noted, quote, the immanent laws of capitalist production manifest themselves in the external movement of the individual capitals and assert themselves as the coercive laws of competition, and therefore enter into the consciousness of the individual capitalist as the motives which drive him forward, unquote. The notion which corresponds to the overall causal relationships of capitalist production is, according to Marx, social capital, Gesamtkapital, in another formulation, the immanent causal relationships governing the capitalist economy transform the totality of enterprise, that is, individual capitals in Marx's terminology, into elements of social capital. That is, they situate them within an economic system which then exercises a conditioning influence on them. It is in this way, according to Marx, that capital constitutes a historically specific social relation of exploitation and domination. Social capital is thus the concept of capital at the level of the capitalist economy as a whole. It is the complex concept embracing not only empirically detectable regularities of a capitalist economy, but also all the laws, that is, those hidden causal determinants of the capitalist system, that is, the capitalist mode of production, embodied in the structural framework of social capital. The individual capitalist is simply personified capital, functioning in the production process merely as the bearer of capital. He or she is not the subject of initiative and change. He or she is subjected to the laws of evolution and change of social capital imposed as incentives on his or her consciousness through competition. 6.4, free competition as a structural feature of the capitalist mode of production. Now, we now propose to focus on the question of free competition, given that it makes possible a profound insight into matters of causality and into the content of notions such as monopolies and technical change in Marx's and Hilferding's respective theoretical systems. Free competition in Marx's conception ensures the reciprocal engagement peculiar to the capitalist system or of institutionally independent production units, imposing on the respective capitals the laws of capitalist production. Competition makes it possible for these separate capitalist enterprises, those individual capitals, to constitute themselves and function as social capital. Through their structural interdependence, that is to say, their organization as social capital, the individual capitals proclaim themselves a social class. They function as a uniform social force, counterposing itself to and dominating labor. As individual capitals, enterprises are supposed to maximize their profit. This tendency is, however, through free competition, subordinated to the laws inherent in the concept of social capital, and more specifically to the process of equalization of the rate of profit and the formation of a tendentially average profit. The tendency towards equalization of the rate of profit is thus a structural characteristic of the capitalist relation as such. Now, this tendency is related to two processes. A, competition within each branch or sector of production, which in principle ensures for each commodity the establishment of a uniform market value and market price. Competition within each branch of production therefore tends in every instance to impose on all the individual capitals the more productive manufacturing techniques, and in this way to equalize the rate of profit. Process B is competition at the level of overall capitalist production, which ensures such mobility of capital from one branch to another, and so that a uniform rate of profit tends to emerge for the entire capitalist economy, that is, a general rate of profit. The shaping of the uniform general rate of profit is achieved on the basis of production prices. These are precisely these prices for the product of each individual capital that guarantee a rate of profit, that is, the ratio of the total profit for a certain period of production to the total capital advanced, equal to, that is, tending towards equality with, the general rate of profit in the economy. Freedom of capital, its concentration and centralization, and its capacity to move from one sphere of production to another, mobility facilitated by the credit system and necessitated by competition, because every individual capital seeks employment where it can achieve the highest rate of profit, are the terms that secure predominance of the tendency towards equalization of the rate of profit. It is in terms of this theoretical reasoning that free competition is to be regarded as an indispensable feature of the capitalist mode of production. As Marx puts it, quote, free competition is the relation of capital to itself as another capital, i.e., the real conduct of capital as capital. The inner laws of capital, which appear merely as tendencies in the preliminary historic stages of its development, are for the first time posited as laws. Production founded on capital for the first time posits itself in the forms adequate to it only insofar as and to the extent that free competition develops. For it is the free development of the mode of production founded on capital. Free competition is the real development of capital. By its means, what corresponds to the nature of capital is posited as external necessity for the individual capital. What corresponds to the concept of capital is posited as external necessity for the mode of production founded on capital. Unquote. By introducing the idea of elimination of free competition among individual capitalists by the large monopolistic combines, Hilferding in Finance Capital substitutes for Marx's macroeconomic view a microeconomic approach, which, according to the characteristics of the dominant form of enterprise, that is, individual capital, shape the whole capitalist system, that is, the social capital, determining its patterns of evolution and change. Now, what we have here is a reversal of the flow of cause and effect in the relationship between social capital and individual capital, constituting a paradigm shift within Marxian economic theory. Now, that's questionable, and we can refer to this later. This shift is associated with the general institutionalist problematic of that time, hinted at in the works of Weber, Veblen, and Schumpeter. Here, enterprises, that is, individual capitals, are perceived as autonomous and dissociated entities. Unlike Soviet Marxists and other heirs to his theory of monopoly capitalism, Hilferding himself was frank enough to admit that his approach was not compatible with his early approach and Marx's value theory. It seems that the monopolistic combine, while it confirms Marx's theory of concentration, at the same time tends to undermine his theory of value. 6.5. Marx's conception of monopolies as forms of individual capital. Now, the above conclusion concerning the paradigm shift introduced into Marxist economic theory by Hilferding's finance capital may be further elucidated on the basis of Marx's monopoly theory in Volume 3 of Capital. The theory is explicitly formulated by Marx contrary to the belief that monopolies can be studied only in the framework of the latest phase of capitalism, which appeared only after Marx's death. Marx's theses can be summarized as follows. The fact that there's a tendency towards equalization of the rate of profit that causes individual capitals to constitute themselves as social capital does not mean that at any given moment the rates of profit of different individual capitals will automatically be equal. On the contrary, there is an evident possibility that some inequalities will be reproduced in the actual rates of profit, albeit within the context of the tendency towards equalization of the rate of profit and not invalidating such a tendency. Monopoly is thus defined in Marx's theory as an individual capital that systematically earns an above average, that is, extra rate of profit. Not, as in neoclassical theory, a company that monopolizes the market. Monopoly is accordingly not the polar opposite of free competition. It is a form of individual capital generated precisely within the framework of free competition, not outside and or alongside free competition, but through free competition and in accordance with the logic of its functioning. In Capital, Marx draws a distinction between two types of monopoly, that is, natural monopolies and artificial monopolies. Now, natural monopolies arise out of monopolistic possession of the natural elements of production, leading to increased productivity by comparison to the social average and increased monopoly profit. Marx says, quote, possession of this natural force forms a monopoly in the hands of its owner, a condition of higher productivity for the capital invested, which cannot be produced by capital's own production process. The natural force that can be monopolized in this way is always chained to the earth, unquote. Artificial monopolies also secure their monopoly status on the basis of conditions of labor productivity higher than the social average within a certain branch of production. In this case, however, the higher than average productivity derives not from monopolization of a natural resource, but from the technological superiority of the specific individual capital when compared to average conditions in its own specialized branch of production. This technological superiority is reflected in the above average profit rates. Marx says, quote, the individual value of these articles is now below their social value. In other words, they've cost less labor time than the great bulk of the same article produced under the average social conditions. The real value of a commodity, however, is not its individual, but its social value. That is to say, its value is not measured by the labor time that the article costs a producer in each individual case, but by the labor time socially required for its production. If, therefore, the capitalist who applies this new method sells his commodity at its social value, he sells it above its individual value and thus realizes an extra surplus value. Unquote. The extra profit enjoyed by artificial monopoly, acting as a coercive law of competition, forces its competitors to adopt the new method of production. Unquote. Artificial monopoly is thus brought into existence through free competition and abides in the midst of it, though at the same time its monopoly position is under continual threat from competition. The same is true of natural monopoly, given that its superior productivity, which derives from a monopolization of a natural resource by the specific individual capital, may well be forfeited as a result of technical innovations introduced by its competitors. 6.6 Social capital and average profit. Now, it follows from the above that the monopoly profit cannot be the predominant characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. The predominance of the tendency towards equalization of the general rate of profit is the social condition that ensures the self-organization of individual capitals into a ruling capitalist class. The various different capitals here are in the position of shareholders in a joint stock company. This is the form in which capital becomes conscious of itself as a social power in which every capitalist participates in proportion to his share in the total social capital. To recapitulate, Marx's theory proceeds on the assumption that free competition is a structural feature of capitalist relations, one not susceptible of abolition. It is only with the evolution of free competition, not with its phasing out, that there can be any association with the development of capitalism. Social capital is not the sum of the individual capitals. It is the social predominance of capitalist relations, adequately secured and elaborated through the equalizing processes of free capitalist competition. On this point, Marx is unequivocal. Quote, capital arises at this equalization of the general rate of profit to a greater or lesser extent according to how advanced capitalist development is in a given national society, i.e., the more the conditions in the country in question are adapted to the capitalist mode of production. Unquote. Now, contrary to Marx's theory, Hilferding and the other classical Marxist writers on imperialism formulated their approach on the basis of the supposed antithesis between free competition and monopoly, a view which became the central tenet of all theories of monopoly capitalism. Our main argument in this chapter is that this thesis evokes an empirically verifiable phenomenon, that is, the tendency towards concentration and centralization of capital in the establishment of very large corporations, but gives no sign of being able to comprehend this phenomenon in accordance with Marx's theoretical system as developed in Capital. It does not take into account that while monopoly pertains, according to Marx's theoretical system, to the category of individual capital, denoting an enterprise which, on account of its peculiar position in the capitalist production process, earns higher than average profit, free competition relates exclusively to the category of social capital and is the preeminent condition for integration of all individual capitals into social capital. Individual versus collective capitalist. We shall close this chapter by putting forward some basic conclusions to serve as an introduction to the arguments to be presented in the next chapters. We have seen that alongside the individual capitalist, sometimes in an antagonistic relationship with him, stands the collective capitalist, the idealized personification of social capital. Capitalist competition and the consequent tendency towards a uniform rate of profit is not just a formal prerequisite to the movement of individual capitals, as occurs, for example, in the analyses of classical political economy. That's number one. On the contrary, it corresponds to a structural process that imposes the terms for the existence and functioning of individual capitals. Capitalist competition in the final analysis reflects the totality of laws regulating the coexistence of individual capitals and their merger in social capital. The concept of the collective capitalist points to the unity of the bourgeois class and so to the capitalist state, whose ultimate purpose is to secure the long-term strategic interest of the bourgeoisie. This form of political unity can only be the final result of a complex interplay of contradictions, always structurally determined. As we already argued, the state is subsequently permeated through and through by the class struggle. Within the framework of a social formation, there can be no conception of individual capital without it being an element of social capital. This means that irrespective of the formal legal owner, that is the shareholder, every individual capital is necessarily stamped with strategies of exploitation corresponding to the class struggle and history of a specific social formation. The functions of the individual capitalist, the decisions that he or she is required to take, are in the final analysis derivable from the dynamics of capital as a social relation and not from some psychological or institutional characteristics which a particular group of people is supposed to possess. Now, I've included a sort of an elaboration that uses some of the same assumptions, and if you pay too close an attention to it, you might get a little misled. But this is I think, an hour and a half tape, and I'll read it at your leisure. And then there is Dimitris Sotiropoulos talking about Marx on money. And so these are, and lest you think this is unimportant, these are guys associated with, what is it, the Syriza, or however you pronounce it, the same party that took over power while Yanis Varoufakis was finance minister. So you kind of can see where they're coming from. Um, but the point of the argument is there are problematic elements in this chapter, and I think I will just mention a few brief ones. That is, you know, when you talk about free competition, I think that's, with all due respect to the Greeks, etc., it's never free. I guess that if you look at it from an institutionalist point of view, free is an interesting ideal, but in practice, just doesn't exist because of all of the different, as David Harvey talks about, the kind of spatial and temporal constraints of the system. So, structurally speaking, to argue for free competition, obviously they acknowledge that in this text, but I think it's more important to see this in its much larger construction and not to get too fixated on certain types of questions about what counts as laws, as it were. There are certain operational principles. There is a price system. There's a monetary system. They are not identical. The problematic, of course, is the question of what counts as price, average rate of profit. All of those things at one level are measurable, empirically possible, but the sort of escape clause that Marx has insisted on, and as certain theoreticians have insisted on, is that while they are different levels of abstraction, they are not so divided as they are between qualitative and quantitative. I think that once you start seeing that these things are by necessity, by structural connection, by the structure of social capital itself, that there are measurable elements of it. Even if you want to indulge from a social science point of view, the kind of arguments that are methodologically made between, or that divide, or that are associated with arguments of qualitative versus quantitative analysis, and which is why for some time I got interested in sort of multimodal approaches, um, multiple forms of analysis that you can actually sort of problematize in a way that allows you to make a reasonable identification issues sort of uh, less problematic, let's put it that way. And this issue of the macro versus the micro, in their session on Saturday, one of the speakers um, argued from this chapter that the differences are macro versus micro. And this is an argument even on the classical, the non-Marxist side, is a problematic one. Very, there's several famous arguments about this, about micro foundations are always embedded in the macro, But on the other hand, let me shift gears for a second. And if you look at Steve Keen's work, the idea of macro construction is probably in the final analysis the most important one because of scale and scope problems. That is, you can't make all these micro arguments and assume that the macro will always reveal them. I think there's problems of aggregation. There are formal problems that are, for example, why David Harvey does what he does to talk about, that there are differences, spatial and temporal differences that make this uh, issue much more difficult, but does not um, acknowledge kind of perfect division of these things. It is simply uneven, and I think if you look at various presentations on the matter and certain arguments that one needs to assume and in fact build it into the model that in this, if you presume a kind of free competition, that it is not fully juxtaposed against monopoly because it's much more complicated than that. And it's easy from a pedagogical point of view to say, oh, okay, well, there's free competition. And then there's monopoly, which helps us to define certain micro things. But the reality is that they're fully integrated and operating at all times. There is a difference between big banks and small banks, for example, or big firms and small firms. And the question of industrial concentration and industrial in broader terms or financial concentration needs to be sort of explicated before you start making judgments about all of these matters. And competition, without violating anything relative to Marx, competition always exists. I mean, it is natural in that sense or normalized. It's just that simply once you start seeing it as how do you see it, in fact, as a agency problem, as a numerical principle? That's the issue. It's so much easier to put it in, as I was talking about yesterday with volume one of Capital. It's very easy to put it in a Roman law, two by two matrix, but that's not really how it works in reality. Makes it easier to understand and to teach, but one needs to acknowledge in a larger model of capital, the Pastone's, code, etc. All of these things are more important. Okay, so I've left a couple of minutes and I've described what we're going to do there. I would note that tomorrow, April Fool's Day, and I'm not going to do any pranking. Um, I would note that we're going to follow on this with something slightly different. Um, that is a different element of a discussion on critical theory in the 21st century, done by a different author, but it was also part of the reading for the critical theory workshop or writing group. And it's an article by Harry Doms of a couple of articles, and it is we may spend the rest of the week on that, and I know that that will be problematic for some folks, but it'll be worth it. I'm trying to promise that it'll be worth it. It's an article for tomorrow called "Critical Theory in the 21st Century: The Logic of Capital Between Classical Social Theory, the Early Frankfurt School Critique of Political Economy, and the Prospect of Artifice." Now, this idea of artifice is actually very important and very important to the Frankfurt School, or at least as a concept. And note, of course, that we're kind of playing around with various little metaphorical elements here that can and will give us problems later on. And remember, we've talked about veils, right? We've talked veil in a variety of ways. And artifice has that same element to it, so that we don't. I think it's important as a matter of argument that we don't sort of reify it. And I don't think Doms does that. I think he tries to square it away in other articles, but he sort of gets there in a very. He takes a pretty long path to get there, which is fine. It is an argument that he's trying to keep in kind of current terms. And so we'll talk about that tomorrow. And this is a similar article of almost identical length, actually maybe a little longer, but I think it does cover some of the key elements. So that's that. Let me see if there were comments. Is this freedom of capital what constitutes both the equalization of the rate of profit and long-term tendency to fail? Now that is the argument. There are without trying to compress decades of thought on the issue, it does have to do with these other interlocking elements, the transformation problem, the organic composition of capital, that there is uh, something, and without going through a whole bunch of hand waving exercises, um, there is an image, a fragment of the idea of diminishing returns to capital, which is a term that Marx would probably have an issue with, but it's not, oh, in some interpretation, not a problematic idea, but uh, a lot of math and a whole bunch of theory has gone into this question of that at one point in the analysis, equalization of the rate of profit helps you to determine price and value issues or price then value. And the long-term tendency to fail has several interlocking elements. What I just talked about in terms of the transformation problem, organic composition of capital, is also overlapped, let's put it that way, framed by some idea of a material and historical kind of argument about that it's gonna fail. It fails because it never fails to. I mean, it never reconciles itself. It never, it's like the market never clearing. It is a moment at which crisis defines it, and that's kind of getting to different points in historical analysis, which asks the question, which Marx did. What is the revolutionary potential of all this, arm waving? And how is it that we can convince people, and from a matter of consciousness, both of consciousness of class, of consciousness of the real relations, of the conscious, um, how is it that we achieve, sort of that moment when, really existing socialism succeeds? It's not that it didn't occur or that it wasn't tried. It's just that as a matter of succession or as a matter of success, it's going to be that there's a question lying in there, and it often requires kind of a very careful historical set of questions, and of course, intergenerationally speaking, some folks, are just impatient. So anyway, there's that. And then let's see. Sometimes you need to find the proper audience to get the actual value of an item. Like whenever a painting bought, yes, absolutely. Like whenever a painting bought for $2 on a garage at a garage sale turns out to be a masterpiece. This is the underlying theory of the Antiques Roadshow television program. Diamonds in the rough, to rationalize your hoarding, hoarding behaviors. All of these are interesting problems because, on the one hand, people save things on the one hand that they think they know is valuable. On the other hand, they don't know that it's valuable, and some things don't acquire value until other things come into place. Um, something scarcity is created because the artist dies, or uh, everything else deteriorates, but this one, because it was buried or whatever, is intact. So there are these little contingencies that are always built into these kind of arguments. So okay, I think I answered the arguments in the or the questions in the chat. I will thank you for your attention, and I will terminate the